What if I told you that on a single morning, one man dismantled the entire power structure of the British royal family and the King of England simply sat in his private study and let it happen? What if I told you that the most powerful love story in modern British history, a romance that survived decades of public hatred, tabloid wars, and even the fury of a beloved dead princess, was quietly and permanently destroyed in less than 12 hours? And what if I told you that the man who did all of this was not an enemy, not a foreign adversary, not a political revolutionary, but the king's own firstborn son? Stay with me, because what happened on June 1st inside the walls of Buckingham Palace is not just a royal scandal. It is the most ruthless consolidation of monarchical power since King Edward VIII walked away from the throne in 1936. And by the time you understand the full scope of what William, Prince of Wales, actually did on that day, you will never look at the British royal family the same way again. Let me set the stage for you, because without understanding what was happening behind the scenes in the months leading up to this moment, the sheer violence of what unfolded will not make sense. For years, the public image of the British monarchy under King Charles III was one of gentle continuity. You saw the photographs, you watched the carefully choreographed balcony appearances, you heard the warm speeches about duty, service, and the enduring strength of the crown. But behind every single one of those polished images, a war was being fought. A silent, brutal, deeply personal war for the very soul of the House of Windsor. And here is the part that most people get completely wrong. This was not a disagreement between father and son about who gets to sit in which chair at Christmas dinner. This was a full-scale institutional conflict between two fundamentally incompatible visions for the future of the British monarchy, and the stakes could not have been higher. On one side of this invisible battlefield stood the Camilla faction. Now, you need to understand what that term actually means, because it was far more than just a queen and her relatives. The Camilla faction was an interlocking network of influence that had been quietly assembling itself inside the royal infrastructure for years. At the center was Queen Camilla herself, the woman who had spent the better part of 3 decades transforming herself from the most despised woman in Britain into a crowned queen consort. Beside her stood her son, Tom Parker Bowles, a charismatic, well-connected food writer and media personality who had built a lucrative career that leaned heavily, and some would say deliberately, on his proximity to the ultimate seat of British power. And operating in the shadows, perhaps the most strategically important figure of all, was Annabel Elliot, Camilla's younger sister. Elliot had been quietly embedded into the physical infrastructure of the monarchy itself, serving as the chief interior designer for the Duchy of Cornwall and multiple royal residences. This was not merely a decorating job. This position gave her unrestricted access to the private spaces of the royal family, direct control over the staff who maintained those spaces, and a constant, unmonitored presence beside the queen at all times. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine you are running a billion-pound organization, and you discover that your rival's sister has been given the keys to every building, the passwords to every system, and the ability to walk into any room at any time without anyone asking a single question. That is the level of access Annabel Elliot had inside the royal household. And to William, Prince of Wales, that level of access was not just inappropriate, it was an active threat to the security and the integrity of his future reign. Now, on the other side of this war stood William. And here is where it gets interesting, because the William who emerged in the months leading up to June 1st was not the cautious, media-friendly prince the public had come to know. This was a fundamentally different figure. Behind the scenes, William had surrounded himself with a hardened core of advisors, many of them drawn from military intelligence backgrounds, legal specialists who understood constitutional law at its most granular level, and a growing faction of the traditional British aristocracy who viewed the Parker Bowles ascendancy as nothing less than an existential threat to the long-term survival of the Carolingian era. These were not people who dealt in emotions. These were strategists. These were operators. And they had been planning for this moment for a very long time. But none of this, none of the factional maneuvering, none of the behind-the-scenes positioning would have mattered without the single most important event that made the June 1st purge possible. And that event was the capitulation of King Charles III. Pay attention to this next part, because it changes everything. For months, whispers had been circulating through the corridors of Whitehall, through the private members' clubs of Pall Mall, and through the most trusted circles of the British security establishment that the king's health was not the only thing that was deteriorating. His appetite for the brutal internal politics of the institution, the endless factional warfare, the constant media management, the grueling physical demands of modern kingship, all of it had ground him down to a point of complete institutional exhaustion. The public image of a monarch smoothly and willingly transitioning duties to his capable son was exactly that. An image, a carefully curated facade designed to mask a far more disturbing reality. The truth was that King Charles was being consumed from both sides. His body was failing him, ravaged by the health challenges that Buckingham Palace had only partially disclosed to the public. And his spirit was being crushed under the weight of an impossible choice that had been bearing down on him for months. Because William was not merely asking his father to hand over a few ceremonial ribbon cuttings and hospital visits. William was demanding something far more radical, far more consequential, and far more personally devastating. The Prince of Wales presented the king with what palace insiders have described as the ultimate ultimatum. And to understand the gravity of this ultimatum, you need to understand what William was actually asking. He was not requesting a gradual, organic transition of responsibilities. He was demanding a comprehensive, legally binding devolution of sovereign authority. This was not a standard letters patent, the kind of document that merely allows a counselor of state to sign routine papers while the monarch is indisposed. This was an entirely different beast. What William put on the table was a transfer of executive control over the management of the royal household, the duchy revenues, and, most critically, the internal discipline of the royal family itself. In plain language, William was asking his father to hand over the keys to the kingdom while Charles himself retreated into what can only be described as a twilight zone of ceremonial oversight. A king in name. A figurehead in practice. And here is the devastating part. Here is the detail that makes this story not just a political drama, but a human tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions. The price of this arrangement was Camilla. William made it unmistakably clear that if the king did not allow a total restructuring of the royal household, if he did not permit the removal of the commercial entanglements, the media manipulation networks, and the nepotistic structures that the Camilla faction had built, then the future reign would inherit a fractured, compromised, and deeply unpopular institution. William laid out the cold, mathematical logic of state survival. He showed his father the polling data, the media analysis, the financial projections. He demonstrated with clinical precision how the continued ascendancy of the Parker Bowles network was eroding the monarchy's remaining moral authority with every passing month. And then he delivered the final blow. William told his father that if the king chose to protect Camilla's court over the long-term survival of the crown, then when William eventually ascended to the throne, he would inherit a broken institution, and the blame would fall entirely on Charles's legacy. Think about the weight of that moment. Imagine spending your entire adult life fighting for one person, enduring decades of public hatred, tabloid vilification, and the constant shadow of a dead princess whose memory was weaponized against you and the woman you loved at every turn. Imagine finally achieving the impossible. Imagine seeing that woman crowned beside you in Westminster Abbey, the ultimate vindication of your life's greatest personal battle. And then imagine your own son, the heir to your throne, walking into your private study and telling you that everything you fought for, everything you sacrificed for, must now be surrendered, not for love, not for principle, but for the cold, impersonal survival of an institution that is older than any single human relationship. That is the choice King Charles faced, and on June 1st, he made his decision. Now, before I tell you exactly what happened on that morning, I need you to understand why this matters beyond the gossip pages. Because the June 1st purge is not just a story about one family. It is a story about the fundamental nature of power itself. Throughout the entire history of the British monarchy, stretching back over 1,000 years, the crown has always demanded a terrible price from those who wear it. Personal happiness, romantic love, family loyalty, none of these things have ever been allowed to stand in the way of the institution's survival. When King Edward VIII fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose very existence offended the moral sensibilities of the British establishment, the institution gave him the same choice: the crown or the woman. Edward chose the woman. He abdicated in December of 1936, and the monarchy survived. When Queen Victoria's beloved Prince Albert faced hostile political opposition from within the British government, the Queen did not bend. She fought the entire establishment to a standstill to protect his position. Victoria chose the fight, and the monarchy survived. But Charles chose neither love nor the fight. Charles chose surrender, and that makes his story perhaps the most tragic of all. Here's where it gets interesting, because the mechanics of what William actually executed on June 1st are as remarkable for their precision as they are for their brutality. This was not an impulsive family confrontation. This was a military operation, a coordinated, pre-planned, multi-front assault designed to neutralize an entire power structure in a single day. William did not approach this as a family dispute. He approached it as a corporate restructuring of a multi-billion-pound global enterprise that had been plagued by internal corruption and competing centers of loyalty. The Prince of Wales had been quietly assembling the operational architecture for this moment for months, working with his legal team, his financial advisors, and his trusted inner circle of loyalists to design a strategy that would minimize public blowback while ensuring total institutional devastation for the Camilla faction. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. 3 simultaneous strikes, launched at the same time, against the 3 pillars of Camilla's power base. By targeting all 3 individuals on the exact same day, William ensured that the faction could not organize a counteroffensive. There would be no frantic phone calls to friendly tabloid editors begging for sympathetic coverage. There would be no desperate appeals to the king for last-minute intervention. There would be no time to rally sympathetic courtiers or activate the informal networks that had protected the Parker Bowles family for over 2 decades. The chess pieces would be swept from the board before anyone even realized the game had begun. As the morning of June 1st dawned, the atmosphere within the royal residences was described by those present as suffocatingly tense. Staff members who had served the household for years noticed something deeply unsettling about the energy inside the building. Communication lines were being monitored. Security protocols had been quietly altered overnight. Personnel who normally reported through the Queen's office had been reassigned without explanation. The traditional hierarchy, the one that had governed the internal operations of Buckingham Palace for decades, had been inverted. And at the center of it all, directing the operation with the precision of a military commander overseeing a complex battlefield engagement, was William. Those present that morning noted something about the Prince of Wales that was more unsettling than anger. It was the complete absence of emotion. There was no raised voice. There was no visible fury. There was no trace of the personal resentment that anyone who knew William's history with Camilla might have expected. What they saw instead was a terrifyingly calm, almost clinical demeanor. The look of a man who was not reacting to a crisis, but executing a plan that had been rehearsed, refined, and war-gamed until every contingency had been accounted for. William was not settling old scores. He was performing surgery on the institution he would one day lead. But that is nothing compared to what comes next. The first strike landed directly on the heart of Camilla's internal power structure, and the target was her younger sister, Annabel Elliot. Now, you might be wondering why William would begin with the Queen's sister rather than the Queen herself. And the answer reveals just how deeply William understood the architecture of Camilla's influence. Because Annabel Elliot was not just a family member. She was the foundation. She was the keystone. Remove her, and the entire structure begins to collapse. For decades, Elliot had operated as Camilla's eyes, ears, and unofficial manager within the royal estates. Her official title as interior designer for the Duchy of Cornwall was, in the eyes of William's strategic team, nothing more than a cover story for a far more significant role. Through her control of the physical environments of the monarchy, from the furniture placement to the staff assignments to the renovation budgets, Elliot had built what amounted to an independent intelligence network across every major royal residence. From Highgrove to Clarence House, from Sandringham to the private apartments within Buckingham Palace itself, Elliot had the ability to move freely, to observe without being observed, and to relay information directly to her sister without passing through any official channel. She was the conduit. She was the pipeline. And William knew that as long as she remained embedded inside the infrastructure, any attempt to neutralize Camilla's broader influence would be incomplete. On the morning of June 1st, Annabel Elliot was served with an official termination of her services, effective immediately. And pay attention to the language here, because the details matter. The directive did not come from the king's office. It did not carry the gentle, appreciative tone that traditionally accompanied the departure of long-serving royal retainers. There was no letter of thanks. There was no expression of gratitude for years of dedicated service. There was no face-saving narrative about retirement or a desire to pursue other interests. The document was stark, formal, and legally binding. It was an eviction notice. Annabel Elliot's services were no longer required by the Duchy of Cornwall or the Royal Collection Trust. Her roles were terminated, her access was revoked, and the door was closed. But William was not finished, because simply ending her employment would not be enough to sever the connection. Elliot still had something far more valuable than a job title. She had physical access. She knew the layout of every private residence. She knew which doors were monitored and which were not. She knew the habits of the staff, the schedules of the security teams, and the routines of every member of the royal family. And so William went further. Annabel Elliot was informed that her security clearances for all private royal residences were permanently revoked. The unrestricted access she had enjoyed to Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, the ability to bypass standard security protocols and walk directly to her sister's private quarters whenever she wished, was permanently canceled. From that moment forward, any visit Elliot wished to make to see Queen Camilla would have to be formally requested, vetted, scheduled, and approved through the Prince of Wales's newly reorganized household administration. The woman who had once moved through the palace like a ghost, unseen and unquestioned, would now require an appointment. The clinical precision of this removal sent shockwaves through the royal estates. Staff members who had reported to Elliot for years found themselves suddenly reassigned to new supervisors, all of whom were William's trusted loyalists. The room she had designed, the spaces she had curated, the physical environment that Camilla had spent years personalizing with her sister's help, all of it was now under the total control of a prince who viewed their aesthetic and political influence as a corrupting element that needed to be scrubbed from the institution. When the news of her sister's immediate banishment reached Camilla, it arrived not as a rumor or a warning, but as a completed action. The decision had already been made. The execution had already occurred. And there was nothing anyone could do to reverse it. Because King Charles, the only person in the entire kingdom with the constitutional authority to overrule his son in this matter, had voluntarily surrendered that authority, the king would not intervene. The king would not even pick up the phone. This is the part most people get completely wrong about the June 1st purge. They focus on the dramatic surface details, the firings, the revocations, the institutional restructuring. But the true devastation was emotional. The true weapon was not the termination notice. It was the silence from the king's quarters. Because when Camilla realized that her sister had been expelled from the royal household, she was forced to confront a reality that she had been avoiding for months. The man she had fought her entire adult life to stand beside, the man who had sacrificed his own reputation, his relationship with his parents, and arguably his relationship with his sons to be with her, That man had chosen to let it happen. He had signed the papers, he had agreed to the terms, and then he had closed his study door and waited for it to be over. But hold on. Because while the first strike was devastating, the second strike targeted something entirely different. Not the internal operations of the palace, not the physical spaces or the staff networks. The second strike went after the external commercial empire, and the target was Tom Parker Bowles. Now, to understand why William viewed Tom Parker Bowles as such a significant threat, you have to understand the fundamental philosophical divide that had been growing between William and Charles for years. King Charles viewed Camilla's children as extended members of a modern blended family. He genuinely enjoyed Tom's company. The two shared long, affectionate conversations about literature, food, and the finer things in life. Charles saw no problem with Tom building a successful career in food writing and media, even if that career was undeniably enhanced by his proximity to the King of England. To Charles, this was simply the natural evolution of a close family relationship in the modern world. William saw it completely differently. To the Prince of Wales, every time Tom Parker Bowles appeared on a television show and casually mentioned his royal connections, every time he published a cookbook that leaned on his access to royal kitchens and palace traditions, every time he attended a product launch where his mere presence signaled an unofficial royal endorsement, the institutional brand of the monarchy was being cheapened. The crown was being commodified. The sacred mystique that separated the royal family from ordinary celebrity was being eroded, one commercial partnership at a time. And in the months leading up to the purge, this erosion had accelerated. Tom Parker Bowles had engaged in several high-profile commercial ventures, including luxury food collaborations, book deals with major publishers, and media appearances that explicitly and prominently emphasized his royal connections. To William's disciplined, military-minded advisors, this was nothing short of trading on the royal brand for personal enrichment. And they had compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting every instance, every implied endorsement, every commercially advantageous reference to palace life that Parker Bowles had made in his public career. On the afternoon of June 1st, the hammer fell, and this time, William deployed the single most devastating weapon in the royal arsenal, one that most people do not even realize exists: the economic influence of the crown. Using his newly acquired executive authority over the royal warrants and commercial partnerships of the Duchy of Cornwall, William ordered an immediate cessation of all official cooperation with any project associated with Tom Parker Bowles. Royal warrants, those prestigious seals of approval that allow companies to display the royal coat of arms on their products, warrants that had been granted to high-end food manufacturers and luxury suppliers who had partnered with Parker Bowles, were placed under immediate and strict review. But William went further. He deployed his courtiers, the discreet and immensely powerful intermediaries who managed the crown's relationships with the British business establishment, to deliver a message that could not be misunderstood. Major luxury brands, high-end retailers, media companies, anyone who had previously sought out Tom Parker Bowles' endorsement because of his palace access were quietly and personally informed that continued commercial association with the Queen's son would result in their exclusion from future royal events, official patronages, and the incomparably valuable social access that proximity to the crown provides. Think about the power of that threat for a moment. If you are a luxury brand, a high-end food company, or a prestigious media outlet in Britain, access to the royal family is not just a nice social perk. It is a commercial asset worth millions. A royal warrant can transform a small regional brand into a global player overnight. An invitation to a palace reception can open doors that money alone cannot buy. And William was telling every single one of these companies that if they chose to do business with Tom Parker Bowles, those doors would slam shut permanently. The effect was immediate and devastating. Commercial partnerships that had taken years to cultivate began evaporating within hours. Invitations to corporate events that would have featured Parker Bowles were quietly rescinded. Media opportunities that had been confirmed were suddenly delayed indefinitely. Tom Parker Bowles's commercial viability within the upper echelons of British society was not just damaged, it was neutralized. But William was not done, because cutting off the commercial oxygen was only half the equation. The other half was ensuring that Tom Parker Bowles could never again use the physical backdrop of the monarchy to legitimize his business interests. William implemented an absolute ban on Parker Bowles's attendance at any official or semi-official state function. Royal galas, diplomatic receptions, charity events hosted at palace venues, even traditional family gatherings that carried any degree of public visibility, all of them were now off-limits. The Prince of Wales made it explicitly clear that while Parker Bowles could remain a private relative of the Queen, he would never again be permitted to stand in a palace ballroom, shake hands with a foreign dignitary, or appear in a photograph that could be used to imply royal endorsement of any commercial venture. The message was delivered directly to Tom Parker Bowles's public relations team. The palace gates were closed to his business interests. The royal currency that had underpinned his entire commercial identity had been canceled in a single devastating afternoon. And once again, the true horror for Camilla lay not in what William did, but in what Charles did not do. The king did not object. He did not issue a countercommand. He did not attempt to soften the blow for his stepson. He did not even send a private message of sympathy. The silence from the king's quarters was absolute. And that silence told Camilla everything she needed to know. Charles had fully accepted William's premise. The commercial parasites feeding off the prestige of the crown had to be detached. And the king was willing to let his own stepson be classified as one of them. Now, pay attention to this next section, because this is where the full strategic genius of William's operation becomes clear. Because the first two strikes, the removal of Annabel Elliot and the commercial neutralization of Tom Parker Bowles, were not the end game. They were the preparation. They were designed to strip Camilla of her two most important external support systems, her domestic intelligence network and her family's commercial leverage, before the final and most devastating blow was delivered. And that final blow was directed at Queen Camilla herself. William's strategy for the Queen was perhaps the most sophisticated element of the entire operation, because it was designed to achieve maximum institutional damage while creating minimum public controversy. A loud, dramatic public banishment would have been counterproductive. It would have generated sympathy for Camilla, created a constitutional crisis, and given the tabloid press exactly the kind of dramatic confrontation that sells newspapers but destabilizes institutions. William wanted none of that. What he wanted was something far more insidious, far more permanent, and far more devastating. He wanted isolation. On the morning of June 1st, simultaneously with the strikes against Elliot and Parker Bowles, the Prince of Wales initiated a sweeping restructuring of the Queen's private office. It was framed publicly as a modernization and streamlining effort, the kind of bureaucratic reorganization that happens regularly in large institutions and rarely generates media attention. But behind that bland institutional language was a calculated demolition of everything that gave Camilla real power within the palace. William terminated the contracts of several of Camilla's closest advisors, the people who had spent years crafting her public image, managing her relationships with the British press, and building the discreet political alliances that gave her influence beyond the ceremonial. Her long-serving communications staff, the individuals who understood every nuance of her media strategy, who knew which editors to call, which journalists to trust, and which stories to plant, were replaced immediately. And the replacements were not neutral professionals. They were loyalists drawn directly from William's own camp at Kensington Palace. People whose careers, reputations, and futures depended entirely on the Prince of Wales's approval. This single move accomplished something that might sound administrative but was actually devastating. It cut off Camilla's direct, unvetted access to the British press corps. For decades, the Queen had maintained highly effective informal channels with senior editors and tabloid journalists across Fleet Street. This network allowed her to shape narratives, bury unfavorable stories, and protect her family from negative scrutiny. It was one of her most powerful weapons, and it had been instrumental in her remarkable transformation from Britain's most hated woman to its crowned queen consort. By controlling her staff and her media output, William ensured that any attempt by Camilla to brief against him, to leak unfavorable information about the new institutional order, or to rally public sympathy for her cause would be detected, intercepted, and neutralized before it could ever reach a newsroom. But the restructuring of her private office was only the beginning, because William then moved to sever Camilla's connection to the actual machinery of government. And this is the part that transforms the June 1st purge from a palace drama into a genuine constitutional event. Historically, Camilla had been a constant presence by Charles's side during matters of state. She sat in on briefings. She offered advice on policy decisions. She had access to the sovereign's official red boxes, those iconic leather cases that contain the most sensitive government documents, intelligence briefings, and state papers that flow between the monarch and the prime minister. Whether Camilla ever had formal authority over these matters is beside the point. She had access, she had influence, and she had the ear of the king. William put an immediate end to all of it. Citing the explicit terms of the power devolution that Charles had signed, the Prince of Wales established a rigid, impenetrable barrier between the ceremonial duties of the queen consort and the executive governance of the crown. Camilla was formally notified in writing that her presence would no longer be required at high-level administrative meetings. Her access to the sovereign's red boxes was permanently revoked. Her advisory role, informal as it may have been, was officially terminated. She was locked out of the machinery of state, reduced to a spectator in the very court she had spent her entire adult life trying to command. The emotional and psychological impact of this isolation on Camilla was described by palace insiders as profound. The queen was left stunned, not just by the scope and speed of William's actions, but by the utter, impenetrable silence from her husband's quarters. When Camilla attempted to appeal the restrictions, when she tried to reach Charles directly to plead her case, she was met not with a conversation, but with a wall of bureaucratic deferral. The king was unavailable. The king's office would review her concerns. The king's schedule did not permit a meeting at this time. Every door she tried to open led to another closed door. And behind all of them was the same devastating truth. Charles had made his choice. He had chosen his son's vision for the survival of the monarchy over his wife's personal interests. And he would not be changing his mind. Camilla found herself isolated within Buckingham Palace, surrounded by staff whose loyalties now lay entirely with the Prince of Wales, married to a monarch who had voluntarily surrendered his ability to defend her, and separated from the sister and the son who had been her closest allies. The woman who had fought for 30 years to stand at the center of the British establishment was now standing alone. And William was still not finished. Because there was one final sphere of influence that needed to be dismantled. Over the years, Camilla had built a significant independent power base through her charitable foundations and her close relationships with various cultural and social institutions. These patronages were not just ceremonial, they were sources of prestige, public visibility, and political leverage. They gave Camilla her own platform, her own network of influential supporters, and her own independent identity within the broader royal brand. And William viewed every single one of them as a competing center of loyalty that had to be brought under his control. On June 1st, William's legal team began a comprehensive audit of all charities operating under the Queen's name. They enforced strict new guidelines regarding financial transparency, public engagement protocols, and the alignment of charitable activities with the broader strategic vision of the House of Windsor. Several high-profile projects that Camilla had personally championed, initiatives that she had poured her time, her energy, and her personal reputation into building, were quietly shelved or integrated into larger royal initiatives controlled by the Prince and Princess of Wales. Her independent sphere of influence was systematically absorbed into William's institutional framework, ensuring that every public appearance she made, every cause she supported, and every charity she lent her name to was entirely subordinate to the Prince of Wales's broader agenda. The cumulative effect of all three strikes, the removal of Elliot, the commercial destruction of Parker Bowles, and the institutional isolation of Camilla herself, was nothing less than the total annihilation of a power faction that had been building inside the royal household for over 20 years. In the span of a single day, William had dismantled it all. And the woman who had once wielded more unofficial influence than almost anyone in the British establishment was left with nothing but a title and a crown that no longer carried any real authority. Now, I need you to sit with the true tragedy of this story for a moment, because the most devastating aspect of the June 1st purge is not what William did. It is what Charles chose not to do. Throughout modern British history, monarchs have fought fiercely, sometimes desperately, to protect the people they love from institutional forces that sought to destroy them. When King Edward VIII was told that Wallis Simpson could never be queen, that the Church of England, the Parliament, and the Dominion governments would never accept an American divorcee on the throne, Edward did not capitulate. He did not surrender the woman he loved to save his position. He looked at the crown, the most powerful position in the English-speaking world, and he said it was not worth having if it meant losing her. He walked away. He abdicated in December of 1936, choosing exile and obscurity over a throne without love. Say what you will about Edward's judgment, about the constitutional crisis he caused, about the chaos he inflicted on his family. He made a choice. He stood by it. And history, for all its criticism, has never accused him of cowardice. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, the British political establishment viewed her German consort with suspicion, hostility, and barely concealed contempt. Albert was mocked in the press. He was blocked from receiving a proper title. He was excluded from state business. And Victoria, a young queen who was still finding her footing in the most powerful office in the world, did not accept it. She fought. She waged a relentless campaign against her own government, her own advisors, and her own court to secure Albert's position, his dignity, and his role beside her. Victoria chose the battle, and she won. But Charles? When faced with his own ultimatum, when confronted with the choice between defending the woman he had spent a lifetime protecting and ensuring the institutional survival of the monarchy under his son's unified command, Charles chose a path that neither Edward nor Victoria would have recognized. He chose total, unresisting surrender. To understand why, you have to go deep into the psychology of a man who, by the time of his coronation, had already spent longer waiting for the crown than any heir in British history. Charles was 74 years old when he was finally crowned in May of 2023, after spending more than 7 decades as the eternal prince in waiting, 7 decades of watching his mother reign, 7 decades of preparing for a role that many people, including some within his own household, had begun to doubt he would ever fill. And when the crown finally came to him, it came not as a triumph, but as a burden, because Charles inherited not just a position, but a terrifying responsibility. The responsibility of preventing the collapse of a 1,000-year-old institution during an era of unprecedented social, economic, and political instability. The monarchy that Charles inherited was not the unassailable fortress that his mother had presided over during the early decades of her reign. It was an institution under siege. Public support, particularly among younger generations, was declining. The financial model that sustained the royal household was under increasing political scrutiny. The global media landscape had transformed in ways that made the traditional tools of royal image management increasingly ineffective. And the departure of Harry and Meghan had opened wounds that the institution had never fully healed, exposing internal divisions that the public had never been meant to see. Charles knew all of this. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, just how fragile the institution had become. And when his own body began to fail him, when the health challenges that Buckingham Palace had only partially disclosed to the public began to take their toll, Charles found himself trapped between 2 irreconcilable forces. His deep, abiding personal love for Camilla, the woman he had sacrificed everything to be with, and his profound, almost mystical devotion to the continuity of the crown.